much. It's good morning, or actually good afternoon. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here, and I'd like to thank IDSA and GIGA for making my participation possible in this conference. As the chair indicated, the somewhat provocative title of my presentations are the United States and China on the road to war. Let me give you a clue to my answer. I'm an optimist by nature, but a pessimist by training. So something of a synthesis of the two will emerge. Since the end of the Cold War, the international system has experienced a prolonged transitional period. The post-Cold War era was initially characterized by what Charles Krauthammer described as a unipolar moment in which the United States' sole superpower status seemed to affirm a position of global hegemony. However, that moment, I would argue, was relatively short-lived, and America's dominance in the international system has been qualified by a series of reverses, such as the Somalia debacle of October 1993, the events, of course, of September the 11th, a disastrous US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, and the global financial crisis of 2008-2009. At the same time, China, as we all know, has rapidly emerged during this period on the back of a sustained and impressive economic and military momentum. It has emerged as the world's second great power after the United States during the post-Cold War period. These trends in the international system have sparked considerable speculation and debate about the US-China relationship. In the 1990s, American proponents of the China threat initially feared that Beijing might be a rogue state in the making, but such a concern has been gradually superseded by a wider anxiety that China's consistent record of economic growth could lead to a tipping point in the global balance of power, a transition in which Beijing would challenge the American-led international order as a revisionist power. Now, in this presentation, which consists of three parts, I will firstly consider the case made by John Mearsheimer, a prominent offensive realist scholar, that the US and China are destined in the 21st century to intensify their global rivalry, and the Asia-Pacific region could be, in his words, the place where, quote, great power politics will return in full force and ensnare the two superpowers in a major war. The second part of the paper, which I will skip over for reasons of brevity, there is a consideration given to two case studies, which is the US-China tensions in relation to the South China Sea dispute, and also the situation with respect to North Korea's aggressive nuclear weapons program. Mearsheimer and other offensive realists believe these are two issues which have high potential for embroiling the United States and China in some sort of war. In the last part of the paper, which I will give more attention to, consideration will be given to how globalization has actually changed the dynamics of great power rivalry in the 21st century. And the argument that emerges is this. It is argued that while the South China Sea territorial dispute and North Korea's nuclear proliferation have the potential to increase tensions and, yes, miscalculations by China and the Trump administration, there is little evidence that the two superpowers are prepared to incur the enormous costs of unilaterally pursuing their interests in the Asia-Pacific through waging a direct military confrontation. So just a few words on Mearsheimer's gloomy prognosis for US-China relations. The theory of offensive realism was articulated at length in John Mearsheimer's book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, and amongst other things, offensive realism maintains that the anarchic nature of the international system and the determination of sovereign states to maximize their power for their ultimate survival predisposes states to behave assertively in international politics. The theory, of course, argues that given the absence of an authoritative international central authority in the international arena, means that states see power, states recognize that the more powerful they are, they are in relation to their perceived rivals, the better their prospects are for survival. So that's the nub of it. In the tragedy of great power politics, Mearsheimer predicted if the Chinese economy, and he was writing back in 2001, if the Chinese economy continues to grow impressively, it will, quote, it will almost certainly translate its economic might into military might, unquote. And I think to some extent it has. And he went on to say, and China will attempt to dominate Asia the way the United States has dominated the Western Hemisphere. In 2014, Mearsheimer reaffirmed there's good reason to think that China will eventually pursue regional hegemony in Asia. The point that Mearsheimer adds, he contends the United States will go to extraordinary lengths to prevent China from achieving regional hegemony. In this vein, Mearsheimer points that the US has ruthlessly acted according to the dictates of offensive realism throughout its history, and believes the chances of a future Sino-American war are more likely than a war between, for example, between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. He believes, as I mentioned before, that flashpoints in the Asia-Pacific could be the catalyst for such a confrontation. Now, let me just move on to the nub of the argument. The cases of the South China Seas dispute and the North Korean nuclear proliferation issue provide little compelling evidence, I believe, to uphold John Mearsheimer's somewhat pessimistic thesis concerning the inevitability of a future war between the United States and China in the future. While it's true that the two superpowers currently have conflicting objectives with respect to the territorial disputes in the South China Seas area, and also, it's got to be said, Beijing has acted in a unilateral fashion to challenge the regional strategic security balance the US has shaped and dominated since the Cold War, it would be wrong to depict China's assertive policy as a strategic triumph. To be sure, China's efforts to expand its sphere of influence through the growth of maritime forces in the region bears some resemblance to the path America followed in its rise to power during the last century. But in the 21st century, China's somewhat muscular policy in the South China Seas has deeply alarmed many of Beijing's neighbours in the region and provided a key stimulus for both the Obama and Trump administrations to reinvigorate the already dominant influence of Washington in the Asia-Pacific. The US-Japan and US-Korea alliances are two pillars of America's involvement in the region and constitute an important part of America's global power. Far from boosting China's hegemony in Asia, Beijing's muscular policy towards the disputed South China Seas may in the long term stimulate a counter-reaction that could nullify and undermine the impact of any territorial gains made in relation to the disputed islands. And unless we assume there are no differences of view within the ranks of the Chinese leadership on the South China Seas policy, and I don't think that is the case, there is likely to be an increasing awareness of the reputational damage that China has inflicted on itself, or the Chinese leadership has inflicted on itself, in a region where it has a tremendous self-interest in being influential. With respect to the North Korean nuclear crisis, and unlike the much quoted Cuban missile comparison, there's been tremendous analogies drawn between the North Korean nuclear standoff and the Cuban missile crisis. The big difference is that the United States and China actually share the same goal for resolving the current crisis in the Korean Peninsula. Both superpowers want North Korea to be denuclearized. While it must be acknowledged that the Obama and Trump administrations have failed to date to reach agreement with Chinese governments on how to achieve this shared objective, there are indications that China has begun to move closer towards the American position in endorsing tougher sanctions against the Kim Jong-un regime. More generally, Mearsheimer's offensive realist approach seems to privilege the agency of great powers in international and regional politics to the point where the structural impact of a megatrend like globalization is largely obscured or minimized. Globalization can be broadly identified or defined as the intensification of technologically driven links between societies, institutions, cultures, individuals on a worldwide basis. Globalization implies a shift in geography whereby borders have become increasingly porous and where states are confronted with a range of transnational challenges. After 3 decades of globalization, all states, including the 2 most powerful in the international system, the US and China, are more interdependent and more constrained and more vulnerable than great powers of the past. And this is a difference that shouldn't be overlooked. It is worth emphasizing that both China and the United States have been inextricably intertwined with the process of globalization. In short, they both have a huge stake in that process. And we can go into why they have a big stake in the Q&A session. Now, despite the populist nationalist rhetoric occasionally emanating from the leaderships of China and the United States, these 2 states can no more deglobalize than they can deindustrialize themselves. It's not that today's great powers like the US and China lack national power or global ambition. Quite the reverse. If you like to use a boxing analogy, today's heavyweights are better trained and pack a more powerful punch than ever. The difference is, however, the ring space in which they operate, the international system, has contracted to a point where if they throw punches, they hurt themselves in the process. So what does this mean? One example of the limits of superpower unilateralism, if we return briefly to the North Korean nuclear crisis case, let's just think this through. On the one hand, despite much talk by the Trump administration that that military options remains on the table, the United States cannot attack North Korea's nuclear facilities without putting something like 25 million residents of metropolitan Seoul at risk, or even something like 25,000 plus US citizens stationed in the Yongsan garrison in the center of Seoul. So the military option is really not on the table as far as the United States is concerned. On the other hand, and I think this has been illustrated by developments overnight with another missile being hurtled over Japan by the North Korean regime, on the other hand, China cannot expect indefinitely to continue to provide a life support system for the Kim Jong-un regime that frequently threatens to use nuclear weapons against Beijing's partners and neighbours in Northeast Asia and beyond, without, and this is the big conditionality, without compromising its own global and economic diplomatic ambitions. So in other words, China has a self-interest in the interconnected world in distancing itself from the regime in Pyongyang, and it needs to do it quite rapidly. So what's the conclusion? The offensive realist claim that great powers run the world and that their rivalry with respect to the South China territorial dispute or the North Korea nuclear crisis will culminate in a US-China war does not appear to be convincing. The story of the post-Cold War era is one of growing interconnectedness, a context in which great power autonomy has been substantially reduced. However, the work of the offensive realists highlights a paradox of the current era in which we live. And the paradox is this: while China and the United States and many other actors, to be quite frank, in the Asia-Pacific region are deeply interconnected in economic terms and mutually vulnerable to international market and environmental conditions they cannot control, they often remain somewhat blind to their own failing powers to dictate security outcomes. It may take a long time before the great powers in the world in which we live come to terms with the realities of the emerging post-hegemonic era. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Patman. And I think he discussed also 3 panelists of this session. They talking about very important concept is about power and especially the complicated dimensions of power. And Professor Patman talking about the technology and information technology advances, how constrain the traditional concept of power, and especially he talking about the current security arrangement in this region now solve the two flashpoints issue. One is so-called the South China Sea issue, and the other is the North Korea nuclear issue. So thanks, Professor Patman. So now we have about 40 minutes. We can open the floor. So we can collect the first round question and then answer. So there's two gentlemen there, and then yes. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Full. We can collect the question full. So we go that part first. All right.